illegal mining actually happened. Even government confirmed, yes, they took out minerals for which they did not have licenses, which is theft. It's illegal mining theft. But then who was arrested? Not the mining company, the community activists. Either the ministries don't care, or they were co-opted or bought.
So if you had to be bluntly honest, who owns Namibia today and who truly should?
Hey, nice question, but let's be very honest.
Yeah.
In terms of the key resources of Namibia, and that I would consider is land, the minerals, and the fishing resources. These are the key economic resources. And overwhelmingly foreign-owned. And this is where, when our president said, we are too few to be poor, it's because of that. Because we do not own and we do not control the resources, and the benefits accrue to corporations that control it. Very practically, about 90% of the mining sector in Namibia is owned by foreign corporations. Fishing, also predominantly Spanish and other foreign companies that dominate it. There are a few Namibians as well. With the land ownership in Namibia, besides the communal areas, commercial farms, 75% today are owned by white men in Namibia. That we're talking here 35 years of after independence. Now that tells you who owns Namibia. We own the flag, we elect our government, we own the parliament buildings and that. We own some state-owned enterprises, like the title says, but the key resources of Namibia, we don't own.
Now, who was probably the right person or the right entity who was supposed to own those resources?
The Namibian people through the state. You need an organization that represents the general public interest, and that will be the state. You can, of course, also have at local level like community organizations that you then say, okay, this particular resource occurs in that area, and that community, therefore, is the owner, and you create ownership. Or you have something like worker ownership cooperatives, where a group together would own either a factory or land or a fishing company. These would be ways in which to ensure a kind of common ownership. But the first step is usually the state public ownership, and then of course to run it well and make sure that the benefits from it go to the general population.
Is there a way we can recover from that at the stage where we are?
Yes, it is, but it's not going to be easy. You will encounter massive resistance from those that own it now. And we've seen a few years ago when government just tried to increase taxes for mining companies, how they blackmailed government to basically backpedal and saying, look, we tell Namibia is an unsafe destination. We say Namibia is not a country to go to for investors. And that was really very ugly from the mining corporations, how far they go. So you have to face a backlash. You need to think it through carefully and strategically on how to counter that. And inside Namibia, of course, with the land issue, this ridiculous willing buyer, willing seller policy, that just doesn't work. And that is neither just nor meaningful for the vast majority of Namibians. That would also need to be relooked. With fishing, you could put a lot more conditions on them to say, for example, it will be outlawed to just catch fish, freeze and take it out, because you don't create job and value addition. So you say any fish caught in Namibia must be processed on land, so that you just export like the final good, the fish packaged and everything. These would be steps that we can take. With mining, the new president has already announced that they will now take beneficiation seriously. That mining companies can't just come here to take out the resource and export, and all the beneficiation is taken place outside.
Yeah.
So these are the steps that can and must be done, because otherwise we're going to sit here in 20 years' time and have the same scenario.
Yeah, and I think back then when the mining sectors now stood up to blackmail the Namibian government, also the people, we ourselves did not also, is it because of the lack of probably knowledge that we don't have? Because those companies are coming in Namibia to mine here because we have better policies, or there are a lot of loopholes where they can get away with most of the things as well. And now just because the taxes were being raised, they threatened the country of deifying the Namibian name, but they left other countries because of the strict laws that they have, and they came to mine in Namibia.
Yes, we found that out with uranium, that in some countries they don't mine uranium at home because of the dangers involved for the environment, for the mine workers. And so countries like Chad and Namibia, where it's then fairly easy for them compared to what it would be, for example, in Australia. They come here and undertake dangerous mines, or you take the Tsumeb copper smelter that we have. In Bulgaria, a country in Europe, that was just not allowed because of the dangers and because of the massive pollution.
Can you take us through that, like what happened there and how did they end up here?
It's a smelter that brings in the copper ore from different countries, ranging from Peru in South America to Bulgaria in Europe. Now, the smelting process is a very dirty business that releases highly toxic arsenic waste. And in Bulgaria's case, for example, a court ruled that this would not be allowed to. Environmental groups took that matter to court and campaigned, and then it was declared because of the environmental impact, the huge, large-scale pollution, this cannot happen in Bulgaria. Now here comes Namibia with the Tsumeb smelter. That was first owned by TCL, then Dundee Precious Metals, and now I think it has a Chinese owner. Ownership changed a few times, but what didn't change is that during the smelting process, hundreds of thousands of tons of arsenic poison were produced. They were released in the air, they found their way into the soil and into the water. And years ago, investigation was already done that declared that actually the area of Tsumeb and surroundings is no longer safe for human habitation, that people shouldn't live there because of the high levels of pollution.
That town.
Yes. And they are still, in very flimsy ways, the arsenic waste is stored in bags around the town. Not safe at all. And so you have then a scenario where these companies say, okay, which country is willing to be polluted? And they create basically what's now called sacrifice zones, where for the profits of these corporations, an area is just sacrificed and destroyed environmentally. And we've seen that happening in Tsumeb. And that shows you how dangerous it is when you don't have tight controls. And it was only years later that Dundee Precious Metal installed some filter system to minimize the pollution or to control it a bit better. But for years and years.
It hasn't. But our own government, do you think maybe they didn't know, or we just don't do research, like especially a background check when it comes to companies, especially mining companies that are coming into the country?
I think they were so desperate to get investors and to create a few jobs that they overlooked it, because the warnings were there. Internationally, contacts have warned Namibia. The UN conducted a study years ago, and government decided to lock that study away, to not publish it. And that tells you it's not a question of not knowing. It was a political decision taken. We let them go on. We'll see that over time we have better filter systems in place. But government decided to contain the disaster. And that is neither fair nor is it helpful in terms of protecting people's health. And of course, in the case of Ramatex, we've also seen the destruction of workers' health and the environment by a company. And government knew very well what was happening, because that was the time I was still at Larry, and we followed that case with the union very closely, and we warned government every step of the way. And government decided to rather shield the company rather than stepping in and saying, this we will not allow to happen. So hopefully from this history, we are able to learn something, that it is just not worthwhile bowing to investors and letting them do what they want at a great price to your own people and workers involved.
Yeah, that's so true. So you have spent a decade or more than a decade advocating for social and economic justice in Namibia. So when you look back, what sparked your personal commitment to these causes, and was there a defining movement or defining moment?
Well, my own personal history was when, before I even came to Namibia, I was active and involved in the solidarity movement and the anti-apartheid movement, where we tried at a global level to isolate the apartheid state and to create pressure for independence of Namibia and for democracy in South Africa. These were the target countries in the 1980s. And then I had the chance to come to Namibia and to meet people here that were involved in the liberation struggle, the late Hendrik Witbooi, I remember, and Gibeon, Jerry Ekanjo, and then, of course, the trade unionists here, Benulenga, John Pandeni. And then I got a teaching job at the Jacob Marengo Tutorial College in '88. And that was my beginning in Namibia, although that was very difficult under the repressive conditions. But it was very clear that Namibia is such an unequal country, such levels of discrimination, oppression, exploitation, that you needed active movements to break it. This would not go away by itself. And but for me, it's a purpose in life. What do you stand for? Do you keep quiet? Do you play along? Do you only look after your own career and your own interests? Or are you becoming part of movements that change, that fight for economic and social justice, and that can make a difference? And my choice was that it's worthwhile going into the trade unions, the workers' movement. Also very strong at the time were the students' movement, NANSO. Very impressive, and felt this Student Worker Alliance was one thing, and it became my home, and that's why I was in there for so long.
Okay, interesting. So Namibia's partnership with corporations like the BS are often criticized for favoring private profits over public good. So if you could maybe redesign these agreements from scratch today, what are maybe 3 non-negotiable principles would you include in those agreements?
Yes, the first one is, of course, the ownership question. The second would be continuously skills development for Namibians to take over the operations completely, and that can be done over a period of just a few years. And the third one would be to look at beneficiation in the country. With De Beers, the big gripe was, for decades we've been sending out Namibian diamonds in raw form. Sent to London to the central selling organization of De Beers. They were cut, polished, and so on. Elsewhere. And it took many years to even do some cutting and polishing inside the country. And this is where hopefully now, with Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah being the president, she has made that a priority, that this should end. And in my view, this was a big mistake to allow it to happen for so long. There should, because with diamonds particularly, Southern Africa is almost a global monopoly. Botswana, South Africa, and Namibia together account for something like 80% of the world's diamonds. So these 3 countries should have just said, no more. Nothing goes out in raw form. You want our diamonds, the deal is local processing. And this is something to learn. And the mining companies, of course, under colonial rule, got their way, whatever they wanted. And this is what needs to be renegotiated with all of them, with gold mines, with tin mines, with copper mine, all of them. local processing, but also learning about environmental dangers and disasters from what happened in Tsumeb. And not seeing that again, because the technology is there that such processing can be done quite safely. And it's often just a cost question. So if you force companies to do it, so any interest in these resources, these are our conditions, then that is the way to go.
The way to go. But what is maybe like now, since like, okay, South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia, these three countries can work together. But I'm not sure, like, probably what is the issue that is stopping us? Is it the resources maybe for us to be able to take up those jobs? Or just the cooperation between the countries?
Yeah, historically, of course, each country did its own deals with the cooperation. So the NAMDEP model was then based on what De Beers and Botswana did, Depswana. And so there is then a bit of learning from each other. But the mining companies, of course, try to corner governments separately and use their weaknesses to get the best deals for themselves. And I remember just after independence, one of the first visitors to State House to see Sam Nujoma was a guy called Maurice Templesman, the representative of De Beers, to make the deal, the NAMDEP deal, because they feared, what if we lose Namibia's diamonds? What if the new government does not give us the license to continue? So they brought that sweetener quickly of saying, we no longer call it De Beers, we call it now NAMDEP, and it's 50-50 shareholding. And that's how they quickly got their deal after independence. And of course, it was government for the first time, maybe also not experienced enough to negotiate a better deal. But by now we've seen it, and it is quite possible for countries now as groups to work together and say, this is our common approach to mining or to diamonds. And wherever they go, they'll have to follow that approach. This is possible, and this is how regional integration and African unity becomes meaningful. If we stop competing against each other, but we take joint action and you say, wherever you come in our region or our continent, these are the conditions. We will no longer allow A, B, and C.
Yeah, okay. So there's a growing global talk when it comes to resource nationalism. So do you think Namibia should embrace a more radical approach to redefining or reclaiming control over its wealth? And if so, what will that realistic maybe look like?
Absolutely. The answer is we need a far more radical approach. And it would be good if it's part of a regional and continental agenda, that it's not just one country. But we need to start here. And sometimes the successes of one country then stimulate the others. That they say, oh, look, they've done it and it worked. So the concrete steps would be, as we mentioned already, like the beneficiation, environmentally safe operations, maximum job creation, localization of skills development. This would be the immediate and first steps that you take. Medium step, also change in ownership. You know, the previous president, the late Geinkop, unfortunately just accepted, no, we have little say here because the corporations have the capital. And he said, the oil is not ours. Now, I would argue that's not the approach we must take. That is the approach we have taken so far. That we say, well, without the corporations, we can't take our resources out, so we must let them do whatever they like. I think no. It's time to turn around and to learn lessons like from Nigeria, where they did that at great cost, and how the Niger Delta was destroyed by Shell. And that you cannot have a catastrophe like that. And in our case, the parallel for me is Recon Africa in the Kavango region. They should just not be allowed to do that, because this smells very much like what Shell was doing in the Niger Delta. And it's time now to put an end to that and to tell them to pack up and go. And to say, this is an area where we can do far more through agricultural production and other livelihood interventions than drilling for oil. I think these are the steps we can take now as part of what you call resource nationalism, in the sense of saying the people of the country must be the beneficiary. And they must be the direct beneficiary, not just some trickle down ones like the company they need some drivers and cooks, and then maybe 10 Namibians get employed to drive the oil managers around and cook food for them. That is not what the benefits that we talk about. This is the colonial pattern, and I think this is time to break it.
So true. And how deep do informal networks of influence run in Namibia's resource economy, and what mechanisms do exist, if any, to expose and dismantle them properly?
That's the difficult part, and you often wonder, how did companies get those licenses? How were they allowed to continue like that? Even what we see right now in Daurus with lithium mining companies, Sinn Féin and others. And the only explanation is either the ministries don't care, or they were co-opted or bought. Because the facts on the ground are so stark. And with that case of UBIG, where community were taking up the issues and showing government that illegal mining actually happened, and then finally even government confirmed, yes, they took out minerals for which they did not have licenses, which is theft. It's illegal mining theft. But then who was arrested? Not the mining company, the community activists. And this is so absurd. That is beyond comprehension, that you then turn the victims into perpetrators. Those who protest these activities and the mining rape of Namibia. And in that case, in UBIG, it was with the traditional authority getting, I think it was $10,000 per month allowance and some laptops, a ridiculous amount compared to the value of the minerals being taken out. But that was seemingly enough to make that traditional authority complicit to the theft. And the community has written to the former mines minister. I've seen the correspondence. So the government just cannot claim to not have known. They knew, but they sided with the company. And they only came to the fore when the issue hit the media and was becoming embarrassing. Now, that shouldn't be the case. The government's role should be to safeguard Namibian and community interests from the beginning. And if any complaint gets reported, you send a delegation out to investigate and to take action and to stop that early on. But what we've seen happened in this case was that government defended the company, played down the concerns. And it was like only after 1.5 years that there was finally an admission that they mined at sites where they didn't have a mining permit. But the community saw the fishy things long ago. And I think there we need to also be far more responsive to communities. As government structures cannot hang in the air and make deals with mining companies and leave communities out.
Interesting. And it's so discouraging, or is for the communities, because if you realize that there's an issue and you decide to stand up, you will know that your own people will sideline you and they will not be able to protect you and all that. So
and that needs to change. And I think with what the new president said, that's where we'll see, will she put her words into action? Because we can be quite sure such practices will continue. So the new administration will then have to step in to stop it and to show, no, we do it differently now. This will be the crux of the matter, to see if the new government will be acting differently to the old one.
Okay. And you've spoken about the Universal Basic Income Grant, funded by resource revenue. So what will be the first steps toward making this a reality? And what myth about the Universal Basic Income Grant would you want maybe to dispel for skeptics?
Okay. The criticism and the skeptic had provided so far two main arguments. The one was, if you give people money for nothing, it makes them lazy. That's the one. The other one is, and that is the predominant one in government in the last few years, that Namibia is indebted, we don't have the money. Now, on the first argument, when you have a basic income grant of, let's say, 500-600 per month per person, that is not in itself an income where you can sit under the tree and say, now I can enjoy the rest of my life. So the level at which it is proposed, and even if it was higher, people wouldn't stop working. They would still want to do things, but they might do things that are more meaningful, that are more interesting, and not just because they have absolutely nothing. They have to take any work, no matter how bad and how exploitative it is. Now, that would be a very good thing. In Ochivero, where we tested the BIG, in that village in Umaheke, the opposite happened. People didn't become lazy, quite the contrary. Poverty kept people back. They were stuck in this poverty trap where you have no future and no possibility of changing your life. You're just, wherever you go, poverty holds you back. And it's very clearly, we must understand, poverty is a human rights violation. It denies people opportunities in life. It denies them a decent life, and it denies them chances. Now, when you break that poverty, people all of a sudden can do all kinds of different things. Some started a bakery, a hairdresser, brick making, clothes making, kind of small-scale activities in the community. And so I would say to people who wonder about, or who prepare that argument, in which world are you living? All the experiences, not only in Namibia, in Kenya, in India, where it was also tested in similar ways, show that people don't become lazy, quite the contrary. Now, the second aspect, the finance. Often, politicians and the critics, they look only at the cost. They say, okay, let's say $600 Namibia per person per month, comes to so many billions a year. Where must that money come from? They don't understand that money circulates within the economy. It increases spending power, it helps small businesses to survive, it reduces malnutrition, it improves health status of people, and all that we've seen in Ochivero happening in practice. It improves educational outcomes. There's an estimate by the Planning Commission some years back that malnutrition alone and stunted growth cost the state around 9 billion a year in the fallout costs of all that. Now, that money would be enough to introduce a basic income grant. So you then have immediately a saving in those costs. You have better health care, better educational outcomes, more small businesses established and surviving, lower unemployment rate. So that must all be taken into consideration. And then you say, this amount that's spent on a universal basic income is very much worth it. The results are so much bigger and so much more important than the initial costs. If we get to that point where politicians are open to that. And we had one very encouraging experience years ago when we took the parliamentary standing committees to Ochivero and said, look, you might not believe us. We're not living there. Form your own opinion. Spend a day there in the village, see what people tell you and see what has changed. And end of that day, all these members of parliament were convinced. And they were from different parties. Before that, they still had their doubts and questions. So sometimes a very practical experience is what's needed to convince politicians.
But then they got convinced, but then what happened probably when they went back?
The former President Pohamba was asked in Parliament if he supports the basic income grant. And he then said, no, he doesn't. He thinks it might make people lazy. And because of the political culture, when the president has spoken, the kind of MPs fall in line. And that hasn't helped. But of course, Hage Geingob was in fact for or interested in, but failed to implement it in his terms as president. And we had expected that to come when our chairperson, Bishop Kameta, was appointed Minister of Poverty Eradication 10 years ago. But anyway, that was just a disappointment. The issue is still there. And we believe also the costs and benefits of a universal basic income grant are blatantly there to see. And Namibia can still do that, and in fact must do that to change the status quo.
Okay. And I want us to move to the green hydrogen project. You have done like some research on that as well, but probably like as Namibians, what do you think are the questions that we should ask when it comes to the green hydrogen industry, and what are maybe some of the loopholes that are currently there?
Okay, it's others in our trust like Shipura and Nafimane work more consistently on it, but in general there were maybe 2-3 aspects that are stunning. The one is Namibia imports about 70% of its energy needs from SADC countries, mostly South Africa. That is largely based on dirty energy, coal energy. We have an abundant resource here in the form of solar energy. And then the question was, why do we move to green hydrogen for export to Europe, to Germany, instead of focusing first on meeting the energy needs inside Namibia? So we would produce an enormous amount of solar power near Lüderitz in the national park to create green hydrogen that then gets converted somehow into ammonium to be shipped to Germany to be reconverted into energy there. Now that whole process, from the technical experts, they talk of like 40% of the energy is lost to just conversion. Also, the site of that green hydrogen production near Lüderitz is not linked to the grid, to the national grid. So you can't even feed that green hydrogen energy into the Namibian grid at this point in time. So what it tells us, this is a project that is there only for German and European interests. It doesn't look at Namibia's energy needs. That's the first big question. And that's where questions arise. Is this just a neo-colonial project, a continuation? Because that's what colonialism was about, extracting Africa's resources for development in Europe, industrialization there. Green hydrogen seems very much in that line. You produce it in Africa because there you have the sun, and then you ship it out to Europe. The second question is, will it even happen? Namibia might lean itself out of the window to get it, but in the end, companies might decide, well, maybe it's cheaper to produce it in Morocco or Egypt or Tunisia, closer to Europe, where you have shorter distances. And the third question is, if we produce that amount of solar energy, why don't we use that energy as part of Namibia's energy needs? Why don't we start focusing on Namibia's needs first before considering export of energy to Europe? It might have been a different matter if Namibia was fully self-sufficient in energy. They said, okay, we can produce more than we need, so what are the export opportunities? But you might start looking at the region first, Southern Africa, instead of going straight away to Europe. So this whole green energy proposal is a European initiative driven by them, and now they try to sell it in Namibia. And I think there are many questions that remain unanswered. the number of jobs, the quality of jobs, how sustainable they are, the overall developmental impact for Namibia. There's now iron production from iron ore, turning that into iron with some of the green hydrogen. Such a project might be useful. And the last critical issue that I can recall now with green hydrogen is the amount of water needed. And that is now something Namibia does not have. And to put up a green hydrogen project in a region like Erongo, like Daurus constituency, which is already a semi-desert, and you cannot use groundwater, large amounts of groundwater for green hydrogen production there, because that groundwater is the source of livelihood of all those small communities in the constituency. You cannot deprive them of a living just to produce green hydrogen. This is completely irresponsible, and so it will rely on desalination, which also requires a lot of energy. Then there's this question of what happens with all the salt and that waste after desalination. Where do you store it, or how do you deal with that? So there are still quite a few unanswered questions about green hydrogen, plus of course what environmental organizations have raised. How do you sacrifice a national park for that when a national park is by definition a protected area?
So a national park is being used in this?
For the hydrogen project, that's the idea. So like a large part of that park would be destroyed for the solar panels, to set up the panels and production. So again, the question is Namibia really benefiting here, or are we used once more for what critics call now neo-colonial energy strategy? And I think the more information we get, the more it looks like that. It was not driven by Namibia's interest, no matter how people like Mr. Mnupe now advocate for it. The hard facts point to that this is clearly a European initiative.
Because I'm also now looking, like say one of the things that I'm also curious about, why is it mostly like, because if you look at the development partners, it's mostly German and Europe. So I'm like, why is it mostly those that are like very much interested in that?
They have a problem. They have one, not ours. They are the main polluters. They are the main producer of CO2 that leads to global warming. These industrialized countries of the north, but also today, of course, China and India joining. But historically, they are the ones. Now, they have been getting away with polluting the planet. And then countries like Namibia, like Malawi, like Zambia, who contribute very little to pollution, face the consequences, brutal droughts or floods in Mozambique. So that's the background of it, that the kind of industrialization based on fossil fuels must stop. It cannot, otherwise we destroy the planet. And we are already at the point where we moved beyond the critical line, as globally scientists have pointed out. So Europe is now looking at a way of getting energy sources that are not based on fossil fuels. And that's where the green hydrogen comes in. So they thought, if we can get our energy from Namibia through green hydrogen, then our output in CO2 will be reduced. So it's a scheme that's driven by their own interests. So they're not looking at restructuring their industries. They want to continue that kind of industrialization just with another source of energy. And that's where the green hydrogen concept comes in. But it's at this point not a reality, it's just a proposal. And so it's a high-risk strategy for Namibia because it is not sure if this will be, in fact, the energy source of the future for parts of the industries in Europe and elsewhere. So, the background is they need to get away from the fossil fuels. And they've made very little and far too slow progress. And that's why we have this global warming. Namibia is not contributing much to global warming. Our CO2 emission is minute, 0.00000, but we face the consequences, droughts and floods as well.
True. That's so true. Okay, so I want us to move to specifically land allocation and ownership. So you have proposed a capping land ownership. So can you paint a practical picture? How would such a system be enforced without creating unintended consequences like black markets or corruption?
Yeah, I don't know all the details because I haven't worked so much on reform, but there are two principles that are important. The question is, what is land used for? We have now a situation where it's become what Robin Sherburne once called a rich man's hobby. So that only the wealthy can run like a commercial farm, but they don't do it for a living. It's like a hobby, a part-time thing. And poor people that would need the land to make a living are unable to get it. They don't get it through the resettlement program, or not many. Farm workers were not even considered a priority group for many years amongst the resettlement. And so we need to look, what is the land used for? And the key issue must be productive use and allowing people to make a living off the land. That requires, because of our harsh climatic conditions, that there must be support structures in place. And this is sometimes forgotten when people say, oh no, these white farmers were the better farmers. No, they got massive support from the colonial regime to be successful. When you look even electricity lines, there are for 100-kilometer electricity lines for 2 or 3 farms. But then you have whole villages where hundreds of people live, and there is no line to them. Now, that shows you the priority in the colonial time that was given. But practically, farming requires significant backup and support to make it a success. And then there should be a priority on people who use it full-time as a source of livelihood. And also then adding to that processing of agricultural goods, that it's not just the initial product, that you turn your fruit into juices, into jams, in terms of job creation. And then the second aspect is, of course, the unequal distribution of land. Now you have sometimes well-off communal farmers that would have the means to become commercial farmers. And then the communal lands should be used for the others who need that communal farming land for their survival. And that was an idea that is there since independence, but it seems not to have worked, because you have then, and sometimes these are famous people like ministers, they have 1 or 2 commercial farms, but they still use communal farms as well. And that means then the poorer people in communal areas, they feel the squeeze more and more. Even illegal fencing has taken place, which denies them access to that land. So this would be what I would see as the principles, that it must be land reform must benefit those who work the land productively, who make a living of it. Those who have other jobs and incomes, they don't need to be the main beneficiaries of land reform. So we need to shift that around a bit. And then the second aspect is this ridiculous understanding of willing buyer, willing seller, that you must be compensated at market-related prices. Now, the history of Namibia was anything but market-related. People were murdered, there was a genocide, the land was just taken, and the colonial farmers got their land and their title deeds often very cheaply. Now, why should they then get a few years or decades later market-related prices for that farm? So there, a much more just approach would be to look in each case, how did you acquire the farm? What was the price then? What would that be in today's terms? And what improvements have you made on the farm? Fences, housing, whatever. We compensate you for that only, but not market related, because that meant you benefited from genocide. The farm got into your family's hands for next to nothing. And after independence, you benefited from hugely inflated farm prices, where all of a sudden there was now a market and government pays, let's say, 10 million or 5 million to you, when what you actually put into the farm was not even 1 million. And then we call that just compensation. No, it's not just. So just compensation cannot be market-related compensation. There will be a massive resistance from the current landowners and also these foreign landowners. This ridiculous scenario that a Russian billionaire can just buy 4 or 5 farms there near Dodapis. That should just never be allowed to happen.
So those are the policies that we currently have, those are the laws.
And then to kind of cover it up, the farms were then seemingly given to government and they gave 99-year leasehold. But that amounts to the same. If you have a 99-year leasehold, you control that land for the next 99 years. And I think this is where conceptually and from a social justice point of view, land reform just didn't work. And it's interesting now that the new land bill is before Parliament this year to look at. I've not seen it, but what will be the changes that this law might bring?
Okay. So as you mentioned, I think at the beginning that you've been in the Namibian labor movement for over 30 years now. So maybe what are some of the projects or some of the initiatives that you have worked on and maybe some of the success that you have achieved while being there?
Yeah, of course there are the basic things, recruiting workers into a union, protecting them against abuse by workers, by employers, negotiating for better conditions. We had a very interesting case at the Husab mine, this uranium mine some years back, where workers were poorly treated and the company just refused to, in the negotiation, to improve their condition, to negotiate what we say in good faith, were really willing. Then the workers decided, well, we'll get at you. So President Pohamba was coming to the mine to open it. And the workers decided a day or two before the visit, they're downing tools. Now for the company that, the president is coming and our workers are there on an illegal strike, that will look very bad for us. So chop, they agreed to the key demands. And congratulations to these workers. They risked their jobs because it would have been considered an unprotected, illegal strike. But they said, no, we've had enough. We negotiate, nothing happens. Now let's go. A similar thing with Ramatex workers in 2006 also, where companies just didn't want to negotiate in good faith. And then a strike forced them. And there was also a very good strike at a time when Ramatex needed to supply its clients in the US for the American market. And they couldn't afford a strike at the time because they needed to deliver. And so that also happened. So these were for me two of the standout actions of Namibian worker. We of course looked a lot at different policies that needed change. We looked at the export processing zones and wrote a report and warned government. But it took government then 10, 15 years later before they admitted in Parliament, finally, that the policy had failed and that it was a mistake and it just helped companies save taxes and get all kinds of benefits that then were basically subsidized by the state. So that wasn't such a wonderful story because it took government too long before they realized that our findings were actually correct. And in the education field, worker education, for me the standout achievement was that we managed to set up a labor diploma course in Namibia. We moved away from just a workshop here and a workshop there towards a consistent course with 6 modules looking at different aspects from what we discuss now, political economy, to the history of the labor movement, collective bargaining, what is globalization, all that was covered in the course. And that was then accredited with the Namibia Qualifications Authority. So maybe these were some of the, for me, the nice things to look back to.
Right. And like, I just want to go back to Ramatex. Like, what caused, maybe for us that don't know, what caused the closure of Ramatex, and what has that impacted? How has that affected the community?
Okay, Ramatex was one of these global textile giants. They come with their machinery and they can set up in any country quickly where they think here the conditions are beneficial. So they look at low wages, at subsidized water and electricity, maybe cheap transport, because their main market is the Western countries, particularly. It was, in the Namibian case, it was all for the US. That was before Trump came in and it slashed all the tariffs. Under this AGOA law, Africa Growth and Opportunity Act of the USA, Namibia could export duty-free to the American market. So Ramatex came here to take advantage of that. Extremely low wages, government-subsidized water and electricity. And but these companies never stay for too long because they look always at other countries where they have even better conditions for themselves. It's typical of globalization. That's how they operate. And so they were here a while, and after a few years, they moved to Cambodia, and another Asian country where they could then produce probably even cheaper. Officially, they of course blamed the workers in the strike, but that was not the reason. Even before the strike, we found on the website of the company that they were considering relocating. And because what they do is they have a few large containers where all their equipment and machinery is in, then they just need a hall, like we set up here in Windhoek at Ramatex. They just need a hall. And then they come, set up their production, and off they go. And it's totally unrelated to the local economy. They don't buy anything locally. Their cotton comes from elsewhere, then they spin it, turn it into textile, and export it out. So you don't have the add-on benefits for Namibia. When they left, of course, there was 3,000-4,000 workers without a job. The Goreanghat Dam was polluted and is not suitable. Till today, the fish all died, and there were warnings for people not to swim in it. There were even pollutant in the groundwater in Windhoek because they had like an open pool. Now the dirty water from the dyeing, when all the colors go in there, was kept there. But when you have a heavy rain in Windhoek, the pool flows over. And when you look where it's situated, you stand at the Goreanghat Dam and you look up, you see Ramatex on top of the hill. So that water flows down towards the dam, but also goes down into the groundwater. So on both counts, protecting workers' health, protecting the environment, we failed with Ramatex.
Yes. Okay. So unions have historically fought for workers' protections, but the unemployed, the gig workers, and the formal workers are often left out. So how could maybe like union reinvent themselves to include them? And should they also expand their fight into broader social struggles like housing and healthcare?
Yes. That is what we call social movement trade unionism, that you go beyond just your small membership base, but you take up other issues as well, like the ones you mentioned. And there are some cases like in Uganda, in Ghana, in Nigeria, where unions have done that with great success. You can then either bring these informal economy workers somehow into your union structure, but it needs to be a bit different to, let's say, mine workers or fishing workers. Or you work with informal economy associations where those working in the informal economy organize themselves, and you bring them into your maybe union umbrella body, like within the federation, so that you have this range of workers being together. And then issues like selling places for informal traders, like housing. affordability.
Yeah.
Could be some of the bigger issues that unions take up that are not directly linked to just wages and collective bargaining. And this is the way in which the successful unions today operate on the continent, that you understand that people are not just in some workplaces where workers are concentrated, but they're spread all over the economy. Now, how best can unions then organize and campaign that it benefits those workers as well? If you have just an increase in the public sector, it doesn't help informal traders directly. So you need to also do other things that happen those workers. And that must always be with these workers directly being involved. You cannot do it for them as an outsider. Never works. You must have them in your structures. They must raise their issues. Then you discuss how best can we achieve that, and then you do that. Sometimes it can be you have small-scale operators that want to benefit from government tenders. Then you approach government and say, change your rules. That our members here, the small operators in the informal economy, benefit from this project. That can be done. So the union needs to, in a way, move away from the traditional way of doing things and saying, look, we have now a different scenario.
Yeah.
How can we represent working people as a whole in very different workplaces? And then take their mandate from that. They're part of your organization and they decide what should be done. So you get your mandate from your members and you're accountable to them.
Okay. And do the social responsibility programs meaningfully compensate for the extraction of Namibian wealth, or are they just there for public relation exercises?
Yeah, that's a nice and easy answer. It's pure public relations. It's ridiculously small amounts compared to the earnings of the mining companies. But when they sponsor, let's say, a football tournament or a school crash or something like that, then they invite all the media and they shake hands with the ministers and the community. And then it looks like, oh, thank you, you're doing so much. No, that's not enough. This is a tiny amount compared to the earnings they make out of the mineral. And I think we must, as Namibians, get over the almost bigger mentality that we're grateful for anything they give us. You take our cake and we must be happy with the crumbs that you throw off the table. No. We want to know, what is this cake? And we negotiate about the cake, not about crumbs anymore. And unfortunately, corporate social responsibility by mining companies, if you look at it in isolation, it looks good. Yeah, they sponsor this and that. But when you look at it holistically, what the value of our resources are, then these are really just crumbs and peanuts. Yes. And I think this is what the new administration now needs to look at.
Yeah, and like some will argue, or some argue, that radical economic reforms they scare away investors, like in terms of like the minings and all that now. So while others say that bold change is overdue. So how do you think Namibia can navigate this delicate balance?
That's the difficult part. That is not so easy. You'd have to see how interested are these companies in staying inside Namibia. If we do this, would they leave? But you'd also need to do very good publicity proactively to say, look, you have reaped all these benefits. We want our fair share now. So that this blackmailing is not going to happen again. But there is no easy way, because you're dealing with very vested interest and companies that are intent on maximizing their profits. Their interest is not the development of Namibia. Their interest is not social justice. Their interest is profit. And that clashes. And so there will be some disruption. It will not be an easy walk, but you'd have to start that, because it's almost like when you fight slavery, of course the slave owners will not just say, thank you very much for your good services, it was wonderful and good luck. No, they fight for their privileges. And it's the same with economic emancipation. When you want to change these economic structures, they will not stand by and clap and say, well done, Namibia, finally you're looking at your own interest. No, they will try and hold you back. So these are not easy battles, but then we wouldn't have won independence if we were not willing to fight hard and tough battles. We would still be a colony. And so this is with economic issues as well. We need to fight for those changes. And of course, we look strategically how best can we do it to minimize the kind of setbacks and disadvantages. But overall, it must happen.
Okay. And like we speak of like Namibia having control of our natural resources and the development of our country, but we don't really, I think most of us, we don't really look at the picture. We don't try to picture how will that look like. But maybe if you could imagine Namibia for 30 years from now on, if the rights policies were put in place today, what will the country look like? And what will everyday life maybe feel like?
In 30 years, we could own a large part of the resources. There would be significant beneficiation inside Namibia. With the new technology, it would benefit workers in terms of shorter working hours, because you can keep productivity levels at the same level without working so long, since you've got now the use of technology. For young Namibians, more options in terms of work they can do and what they would like to do. A guaranteed income for everyone that would enable that, and that would fund itself continuously through resources, through taxation on incomes. And therefore, like the president said, there wouldn't be poor people anymore. And we would move away towards decent housing and all this. This is where we need to go to. And it is possible, given the resources we have in Namibia, but the control over the resources is the tricky issue.
But what now if the economic system doesn't change? What future political consequences could raise from the masses? The youth unemployment may be the frustration as well.
Yes, exactly. And we are at that point. We are at the tipping point now, where young people don't want to hear just promises of what might happen. Their situation is desperate. You have now a scenario where the president was quite strong and brave in saying fees have fallen. A tertiary institution, no registration fee, no tuition fee. So you enable Namibians to go to tertiary education. But then what? If we don't change economic structures and the way it works, then you have more and more graduates at tertiary institutions, but more and more of them still not being able to find work. And that's the ultimate test. Your qualification, your education is important for your self-development, but after a while you need to be in a position where you can sustain yourself and your family. And if that doesn't change, then the disaffection amongst young people will grow. There is no doubt. They will certainly lose faith in political parties. They will lose faith in the political system. They will become impatient. We will probably see clashes in the streets with demonstrations and police trying to counter it. These are all the things that will worsen, and of course crime levels, if we do not make those changes. And that's why I say we are at a tipping point. If 60% of young people today are unemployed, you cannot expect them to be patient. They can't be.
Yeah,
They can't. There is just, and it means also that at household level, the few with incomes need to cater for more and more people. And especially in rural families, they sell their goats, they sell their cattle to send their children to university in the hope that through a university education they have a better life. And then the children will look after me when they finish. Now they graduate, you've spent all your resources on it, and they can't find work. Now you still have to maintain your children after. And that's terrible for the children who feel failures, although it's not their fault. It's just the economy that doesn't provide it. And it's terrible for the families who then struggle to just keep alive. And that's why the point at which we are at is, look, we must now make these changes. And in my view, we cannot avoid a universal basic income grant in the near future to avoid this scenario. You cannot let people live off going through dirt bins and things like that and think we can remain somehow peaceful and tranquil. No. It's breaking point. Things need to change now visibly, not speeches. We had speeches for many years.
Quite many,
And young people want to see changes in reality, and absolutely rightly. Can't be otherwise.
And with the new free fees must fall, which is like a really that's what you've been calling for as well. But what may be some of the challenges that we must be ready for as a country as a result for that come next year, if that is actually implemented, in terms of universities, students and all that?
Government will have to, of course, look at its finances. How much does it cost to implement that plan? They already will make savings by closing NASFAF and bringing that into the ministry. Then you don't have all these administrative costs. They built this huge building for themselves, and which doesn't help students. That's just a luxury for a few staff members. So government will look at that, and of course the now Minister of Education was the former permanent secretary or executive director now. So she knows the system administratively. I guess they looked at it already before the announcement, that how much more money would it need? That's the one aspect. For the students themselves and their parents, is the question of social inequality is still there. Because even if you don't have to pay for tuition, for registration, that part is free. If you still need to live, you still need a place to stay, you still need to eat, you still need transport money. Now, government, of course, cannot take those costs. And she said that for now, they're looking only at tuition and the registration fee. The president said so. So families still have costs when they send their children to universities. Maybe if there are more universities nearer by, so you go to a campus nearer to you and you can still stay at home, that might help you reduce. But if you have to move to another town, then it's rental and that. So the pressure on parents is still there. And for those from richer families, it's easy then. But for those from poorer families, there will still be some challenges. But overall, it's a step in the right direction. It will make it easier. But then, of course, the question is how many students can be accommodated. If UNAM receives, let's say, 30,000 applications, how many can they actually accommodate in their courses? And then, as we discussed now, when they're finished, what then? Are we just going through educational cycles without changing the economy? And that needs to happen parallel. The educational institutions then need an economy that can absorb.
To close off, so many young Namibians feel disillusioned about the real change ever happening. So maybe what will you say to these young people today?
I'm myself getting to a point where I wonder, was my optimism of over the years an illusion? 10 years ago, if we had sat here, I would have told you things are changing now. We are getting a universal basic income grant. That was just after Bishop Kameta was appointed and President Geingob made his first State of the Nation address. And basically, many of the issues about poverty and exclusion were addressed there.
Yeah.
And we were then also told, no, the BIG is coming. Government decided, the president is in favor. And then it never came. So we were never told, and we were at that time working closely with the minister, and we were together. We had been together for 10 years already in the Basic Income Grant Coalition and campaigning for it, and still it didn't come. That was, for me, also a turning point, like how much can you believe of what is promised? Now the new president, Netumbo Ndaitwa, said, don't judge the book by its cover. Give us a chance to prove that we change things. So a statement like that shows me that she's aware that Namibians are watching now. They want to see what are the changes. And for young people, my advice is not only see, but pressurize. Don't be a spectator. It's your life, your future, your country. Stand up and demand the things that you are convinced about. And in that sense, it was for me encouraging how young people have joined the Basic Income Grant campaign in the last few years and pushing for it, as they think this is something that will benefit us, that will help us change Namibia from the way it is. And these are important steps. And my advice is, don't ever just rely on politicians. Don't sit back and say, the president promised this and the minister said that. Push for the things. Be active in this democracy and make your demands and wishes heard to put the pressure on the politicians to act. So this kind of very active participation by young people will be crucial to push things. And we've seen, for example, that the new president also didn't mention the basic income grant in any of her speeches. So very clearly, if young people feel this is the way to go, we must make the demand heard and present it to the president as well. Have a discussion with her and her cabinet colleagues and explain why it is so important. And this is, I think, generally with changes. My own life experience in the unions 35 years ago, we were virtually certain, no, this is our government, these are our comrades that are taking over. These things will just change. And workers' rights and the living wage and all that will just come. And it didn't come in the way we had expected. So it was a very slow process of change, and we see now how many workers are still struggling. And I think that's for me one lesson: never sit back and wait. Always push, always engage, and understand this is our country, and we must make the changes and live the changes we want to see, no matter who might be elected in parliament.
Interesting. Because now, does it fall to the person themselves? Because now these people that joined the government, like your comrades that you mentioned, they were part of the basic income grant. They were the one that were pushing for this, but then they enter now into the decision-making body, and then it even became more difficult. Was it the system, or is it just them themselves, probably?
It's a system that captures people. And once they are in there, then they don't know anymore how to push for what they once believed in. And it's not just about the basic income grant. That was one example with Minister Bishop Kameta. But we've seen it also before already in the unions. Ponele Frans was the president of the National Union of Namibian Workers. He became member of parliament. His issue was give the land back to the people. He was totally opposed to the willing buyer, willing seller. policy. In the unions, we could see from the beginning this is not going to work.
Yeah.
So he entered parliament on the ticket of SWAPO, and he made a speech in parliament about this land issue. And then one of the SWAPO elders said, Comrade Panele, sit down. You are not representing the unions here. You are now here on the party ticket. And that was for me, that's precisely what happens. You enter these structures, and then you find it very difficult. You're cut off from your old constituency. And so the push must be ongoing, no matter who is in power.
Yeah.
There must be pressure from outside for governments to act. And one positive example that we had was with these labor hire companies that also workers experience as super exploitative. Then we did a study at Larry, commissioned by the Ministry of Labor. And then actually Parliament decided to outlaw labor hire companies. Unfortunately, the case was reversed by the Supreme Court. But in terms of political pressure, I thought this was an interesting case where the union protest against labor hire found its way into Parliament and was then supported by parliamentarians. And I think on many other issues we need that kind of process as well, where the pressure from outside, from the affected communities, is heard in Parliament and they need to respond.
Okay, and us as young people, how can we be rightly doing it in the right way? How can we engage in this discussion? How can we push for this? Because sometimes we're just on social media, we see a post by the Namibian and we are there complaining. But how can we do it in the right way, in a way that we know that it will result in a change, it will result reaching the right people?
Yes. This is a bit the danger of the generation today, the young people, that the social media is almost the beginning and end of everything. People are on groups, on posts, and they think this will somehow change. No. Pressure requires an organizational form. You need to find a way of organizing that you speak with a united voice on behalf of a large group of people. When that happens, and you have young people on a large scale, and for example, ahead of an election, you tell the political parties, no BIG for us, no vote for you. Then it's a powerful tool. But if you are individual young people spread across the country and each one does his or her own thing on social media, you can't get that message across collectively. And so the power of a collective voice is still very important for young people. In the past, it was organizations like NANSO. Today, it will be other organizations of young people. And the BIG campaign could be one such thing through which young people express their collective voices, but there might also be others. But that is always important that you have a constituency. You represent either a community or a large group of workers or a large group of young people. Then you get taken seriously. If you represent just yourself.
Yeah, so true.
Our studies at Larry and the interaction with the media would have been meaningless if it wasn't that we've done that on behalf of tens of thousands of workers and their unions. That is the social base for engagement.